The end to 2022 also brings about the end to the Ricciardo-McLaren saga. After being dropped by McLaren despite having another year on his contract, he did have opportunities to stay on the grid, with Günther Steiner at Haas basically admitting that if Ricciardo called him, the seat would be his. But Ricciardo made it clear that time away from Formula 1 is what he needs in 2023, and despite rumours of a reserve and simulator role at Mercedes, Ricciardo felt that going back to Red Bull as the team's third driver is the right move for him. As far as what Ricciardo will actually do next year, he openly admitted that this really is more of a part-time role that will still allow him to keep one foot in Formula 1. To all intents and purposes, he will do some sim work, he will attend some of the races, and he will also do a few donuts in old cars for promotional activities. There is absolutely no promise of a seat, and there isn't even a promise of any testing or actual seat time in either their 2023 car or even a previous gen 2021 car. I don't know about anyone else, but the way Ricciardo has left leaves me with absolutely zero closure. At no point has he said that he's 100% done with the sport and that Abu Dhabi was his final race, but at no point has he also said that there is a 100% concrete plan to get back on the grid for 2024. For Ricciardo to come back at any point in the future, there's three things that all have to align. He has to believe that he's still got the speed and ability to be able to perform. He has to have the motivation and drive to compete at the highest level, and a team has to give him an opportunity if they think that he's the driver that they need. Now, many people might say, and I know this because I've actually heard it, that there isn't really any need for Ricciardo to come back. He was terrible at McLaren, and regardless of past performance, it doesn't guarantee future success. Why should he even deserve another chance in F1 if he actually turned down a seat, and especially when in the next year or so, there might be a new raft of young talent just waiting to burst into Formula 1. The problem with what I am going to call the Nico Hülkenberg dilemma is that it kind of doesn't matter what fans think. It matters what the teams think when assessing a driver who has been out of Formula 1. When Haas were looking for a driver for 2023, and it seemed to be between Schumacher, Hülkenberg, and even Giovinazzi at some point, whilst I still maintain that I would have given Mick another season, Günther said that the team wanted to go in another direction and that a solid, experienced driver is the route they wanted to take. Not only did Nico Hülkenberg tick that box, despite not racing full-time since 2019, but he proved to Günther that the hunger and fire were still there to compete in Formula 1. On paper, if Ricciardo wanted to return, he would already be at an advantage over most young drivers because, as bad as his time at McLaren was, a team would still choose an 8-time Grand Prix winner over even a Formula 2 champion in some cases. Even though, as I said, past performance is no guarantee of future success, Ricciardo still has plenty of credit in the bank that gives him the upper hand even over drivers like Mick Schumacher. So whilst I do think that some teams will still be willing to take a punt on Ricciardo in 2024, the bigger problem for me is his mentality. I'm not going to analyse what went wrong at McLaren because McLaren and Ricciardo himself in a recent interview on Beyond the Grid admitted that he still doesn't know. Whilst I think in 2021 it was mostly down to the fact that Ricciardo's driving style just wasn't compatible with the MCL 35M, when it comes to 2022 and the MCL 36, even though there is still clearly some kind of McLaren DNA that might have contributed to Ricciardo's struggles, all season I've genuinely believed that because Ricciardo and McLaren spent so much time and mental energy in 2021 to try to figure the problem out, as soon as there were any bumps early in the season, I think Ricciardo very quickly just became completely shot mentally. He described finally finishing the grueling 22 race season as relief in the podcast. And to me that's why I think even if there were offers on the table, the mental fatigue has just become too much for Ricciardo, and that's why he was so much more content with taking a year out and recharging the batteries. He seems hungrier and happier to have reached the end of the season and to take 2023 off than he is to immediately jump into a Haas, for example, to try to prove to people that the old Ricciardo is still there. Away from Formula 1, Ricciardo will have to prove to himself that after recharging his batteries mentally, that the desire and hunger to be in Formula 1 is still there. When Fernando Alonso left McLaren in 2018, he didn't do it because he was burned out. He did it because after being given terrible cars for year after year after year, at some point enough was enough. In the 2 years that he spent away from Formula 1, he became a Le Mans 24-hour champion, and he also won the Daytona 24-hour as well. But the hunger to drive in F1 never went away. If anything, by 2020, he was scratching and clawing, looking for a way, any way to get back into the sport. And although there was a huge amount of backlash when he first got announced, which seems to have been forgotten about, looking at the levels that Fernando Alonso has driven in 2022, you can't say that even at 41 years old, there is anyone more motivated and determined still than Fernando Alonso. Ricciardo has to prove to himself that, just like it did for Alonso, it has to hurt being out of Formula 1. That's when you know that mentally that you still have something left to prove, and that you still have that ultimate sense of self-belief, that you still have the speed and desire to compete at the highest level. Ricciardo, however, will always have that doubt that will play on the back of his mind somewhat, that he now knows that there is some kind of car concept that can expose his weaknesses. And even if he comes back at 100%, there is still the possibility that his weaknesses will be exposed again. How that will play on his mind and affect his confidence, only he will really know. The question as to what really went wrong with a driver as good as Ricciardo at a team on the up and as good as McLaren will never truly be answered. It's literally like the Australian version of Stonehenge, just a mystery of the universe, because a driver that I ranked as the 4th best driver in 2020, for that driver in the space of a year and a half to be retired by Lando Norris is just nuts to me still. But that's Formula 1. Whether we'll see Ricciardo back in F1 or not, whether mentally Ricciardo after a year out will even want to come back, will be an interesting story to keep an eye on in 2023. There is also the chance that Daniel really feels like being out of Formula 1 is where he wants to be, and that his career as an F1 driver really is over, and there's nothing wrong with that either. I'm sure, however, that he will keep an eye on the Red Bull situation, and obviously, despite the fact that Checo does have a contract for 2024, Ricciardo knows that if things go south in the Max and Checo relationship, if Checo's results start to cost the team, there is a slim chance that he could put himself in the pound seat to return as a full-time Red Bull driver alongside Max. In his year out, Ricciardo has to find out himself if the desire and motivation to return is bigger than the fear of failing again. But what do you think? Will Ricciardo recapture that need to race in F1 again, or will he actually realize he doesn't need or want to return? Will we ever see Ricciardo back in Formula 1?